Q&A session, but first I give the floor to the President of the European Council.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I am pleased that we could speak by video conference to discuss important topics for both the EU and China today. In fact, our diplomatic relations are 45 years old this year and evolving. Our discussions today were open and substantive, and we discussed many topics we agree on, but of course we discussed also topics we disagree on. We focused on 4 important areas. The first one, COVID-19 and the economic consequences, the economic recovery. The second one is the EU-China relationship. The third one is Hong Kong and the important question for us of human rights. And the fourth topic is related to the international issues. Concernant le premier aspect,
on the first topic, COVID-19 and its repercussions, we had an opportunity to say how important it was that we had total transparency and take stock of the international response to the pandemic. We also highlighted how we had become very active on trying to seek out a vaccine, which we think should be a common good, which would be accessible to the whole world and at an affordable price. And we also think that an ambitious recovery, economically speaking, will be extremely important. And we have explained the European procedures, the European budget, the MFF, and a recovery fund to support the economy.
EU-China relationship, and we stressed the need to implement the commitments made at the 2019 EU-China summit. More particularly, we discussed very concrete topics. The first one is trade. We have a dynamic trading relationship with China. We trade on average over 1 billion euros a day. It's huge, and the EU is China's first trading partner. But progress is needed in many areas to rebalance this relationship, and we made clear that we need to resolve concrete problems such as market access, subsidies, regulatory issues, public procurement, forced technology transfers, level playing field and WTO reforms. Nous avons aussi eu l'occasion.
We also had an opportunity to say on both sides that we think it's important to continue intensive work on negotiating an ambitious investment agreement. And we also noted progress on the agreement on geographical indications, which we hope to be able to wrap up in the near future. Now, of course, there's an essential topic we had an opportunity to touch upon, that is to highlight climate change and the need for an international response to this. We really need to work on stability because climate change is a threat to humanity, to the entire world, and also because we feel that there's a clear link with the economy and with the trade issue. So we need to work on climate change too, to ensure that there is as little unfair competition as possible globally, which is linked to climate change. Now, you know our objectives for 2050 and what we've done on 2030 on that target. And we believe that we need to work very hard on this issue in international and multinational fora so that we can get a more general response to climate change. We also had an opportunity to discuss the digital agenda and the need to ensure that we have confidence, trust, that we can fight against threats to cybersecurity, that we need to fight all the disinformation techniques which are being used, which will undermine people's trust.
Hong Kong and human rights. We expressed our grave concerns about the proposed national security law for Hong Kong. We called on China to follow the promises made to the people of Hong Kong and the international community regarding Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy and guaranteed freedoms. Je voudrais ajouter que nous...
I'd just like to add that, of course, we support the idea of the concept of one country, two systems. We stress that 50% of EU investment in China actually transits through Hong Kong. There are 1,600 European-linked companies that are active in Hong Kong. Now, we think we have to respect the political neutrality of those businesses. We cannot accept pressure being put on them to waive from that political neutrality. We've also discussed the whole issue of minorities and human rights, respect of human rights. We mentioned specific cases, a Swedish national and 2 Canadian nationals. I think you're familiar with those cases. We believe that their detention appears to be arbitrary in nature. Finally, we had an opportunity to raise international issues. We talked about Iran. We exchanged our views on that. We also talked about Afghanistan and the Korean Peninsula. And we appealed to all to get involved in trying to achieve a peaceful solution multilaterally. We also raised the issue of the safety of shipping, maritime transport. The vast amount of world trade is channeled by ship, and it's very important for the situation in the South China Sea to settle and to ensure that there is security and economic development. Now, this video conference has given us an opportunity to have an in-depth, intensive discussion. We've touched upon a whole raft of national, international and bilateral issues. And this kind of meeting, this kind of video conference is an opportunity to emphasize democracy, the rule of law, human rights, the protection and defense of minorities. And we've had this dialogue without any taboos, no holds barred. We've had a frank and open discussion. We've indicated the areas where we feel we should make progress on trade, on the economy. And it's an opportunity to take action, deeds, not just words. We also think it's very important to stress the importance of strategic autonomy for the EU in the future. We believe that this relationship has to be founded on transparency and reciprocity. It's with that in mind that we intend to press on with this discussion at the highest level. After the summer, in fact, we will have an opportunity to continue with this high-level dialogue. We'll be able to take stock on what has been achieved in the meantime, revert to these somewhat more difficult topics. Now, there was supposed to be a summit in Leipzig in September. It won't be possible to hold that. However, we do hold out some hope to hold such a summit at some stage where the Chinese authorities could meet the 27 leaders of the EU. So those are the subjects I wanted to talk about to you this afternoon.
Thank you. Indeed, the relationship between the European Union and China is simultaneously one of the most strategically important and one of the most challenging that we have. Today's summit has been a much-needed opportunity to discuss and move forward on all aspects of this complex and vital partnership. Our discussions were both intense and they were indeed wide-ranging, from trade and investment to climate action and the digital field, from Hong Kong to human rights and, of course, the coronavirus response. And we are able to discuss all these issues with China, but I must say mostly important was and is that we must make progress. For this, the summit was only a starting point. Progress implies cooperation on both sides, implies reciprocity, and implies trust. These have been central pillars of our discussions today. And Charles has already focused on many of the important issues that we discussed, including on Hong Kong and human rights. And I do not want to repeat what has been already said. But let me reiterate that for the European Union, human rights and fundamental freedoms are non-negotiable. We always raise our concern, so was it today too, and insist on having our view on these topics. Of course, we discuss trade and investment. And indeed, the European Union is China's biggest trading partner, and China our second biggest. We will soon be in a position to sign our agreement on geographical indications. This guarantees a high level of protection for our respective producers, and that is good. And yet, we continue to have an unbalanced trade and investment relationship. We have not made the progress we aimed for in the last year's summit statement in addressing market access barriers. We need to follow up on these commitments urgently. And we also need to have more ambition on the Chinese side in order to conclude negotiations on an investment agreement. These two actions would address the asymmetry in our respective market access and improve the level playing field between us. In order to conclude the investment agreement, we would need, in particular, substantial commitments from China on the behavior of state-owned enterprises, transparency in subsidies, and transparency on the topic of forced technology transfers. And we have raised these issues at the same time with Premier Li and President Xi, that we expect that China will show the necessary level of ambition to conclude these negotiations by the end of this year. I think it is important that we have now a political high-level approach on these topics. I've also made clear that China needs to engage seriously on a reform of the World Trade Organization, in particular on future negotiations on industrial subsidies. This is the relevant framework where we have to work together on the topic. It's a difficult topic, but this is the framework which we have to establish, to have common binding rules we agree on. And we must continue to work on tackling Chinese overcapacity, for example, in the steel and metal sectors and in high technology. Here, for us, it's important that China comes back to the international negotiation table, that we sit down there and find solution. We also pointed out the importance of digital transformation and its highly assertive approach to the security, the resilience and stability of digital networks, systems and value chains. We have seen cyber attacks on hospitals and dedicated computing centres. Likewise, we've seen a rise on online disinformation, and we pointed out clearly that this cannot be tolerated. We've also discussed climate action, and climate change remains the global challenge of our generation. China has repeatedly projected itself as a leader on global climate issues, and China is indeed on our side on this. However, being a leader brings responsibility to follow up with actions. We urge China to commit to climate neutrality as soon as possible after 2050. And we count on China to live up to its commitments under the Paris Agreement and step them up and lead by example. We look forward to seeing decarbonisation play a big role in China's upcoming next 5-year plan, as the European Green Deal plays a big role in our strategic agenda as well. And last but not least, the coronavirus pandemic. When the virus hit China, the European Union responded swiftly. We coordinated and co-financed the delivery of over 56 tons of emergency medical supplies. China then reciprocated when Europe faced the pandemic, and we agreed on the need to continue this mutual solidarity. We agreed also in supporting countries and populations that are more vulnerable than our own, for example, in the context of the global response initiatives. Well, to conclude, today has been a very intense, a very frank and a very open meeting. We would want and expect nothing less. This was good. It is not possible to shape the world of tomorrow without a strong EU-China relationship. However, it is time to accelerate on the very crucial areas of our relationship, to deliver on the important commitments from last summit and address our concerns on reciprocity and the level playing field. As European Union, we're committed to making swift and substantial progress. We count on the Chinese leadership to match our level of ambition.
Thank you, Madam President. We have a couple of questions. Could I please ask you to turn on your cameras and raise the blue hand, as you know by now? And the first question we're getting is from Lawrence Norman. Please, Lawrence, could you say to whom you want to speak as well?
Good afternoon, thanks a lot. Whichever of the President wishes to respond to this. It's a question on the trade and economic side. You've made clear what you pressed the Chinese on and the issues that they have not delivered on. What was their response? Were there any fresh promises today to deliver on what they promised last year on the trade and investment side? And what did you say to them would be the consequence if these issues are not resolved by the end of the year, including the issues around the investment agreement? Thank you.
Madam President.
So on this trade issue, indeed, we were very intensive in all the meetings today on this issue. And indeed, our interlocutors responded that they explained their view on the topics, be it the level playing field or being subsidies or being market access. For us was important that it is completely okay to exchange different views and to have different standpoints. But we expect now to step up and to lift the negotiations that so far have been on a very low level to a higher political level, that we really see the dedication to have at the very end an investment agreement. So for us it's important that we step up the level of attention these negotiations get before the end of the summer, because then this would give us a real chance to have an investment agreement till the end of the year. If this is not possible, it would be a pity, but this also would be difficult then to develop our agenda 2025 together, because we have the intentions to work together. There are the words put on paper, but we also need the deeds, and we also need to see that there is really improvement on the topics where we have different opinions.
I would like to add that we need more political leadership in order to explain clearly why it's so essential for the European Union to take more into consideration this question of the level playing field, for example, or another concrete example, the subsidies. And, for example, we made clear that it was essential for us to make more transparency about this question, because a fair competition is clearly needed. And I hope that because of this decision today, it will be possible in the next months to make more concrete progress. It will be difficult. We are not naive. We are aware about the huge difficulties, but it's essential for our businesses to be able to have a fair access to the Chinese market. If we open the open market, it's also important at the same time to have more reciprocity.
Thank you, Mr. President. Next question for Stuart Lau from the South China Morning Post.
Thank you. This is Stuart Lau from the Morning Post in Hong Kong. I have a couple of questions for President von der Leyen, if I may. My first question is a more general one. You just got off the phone with a leader that some would regard as the world's most powerful man, but others describe him as an autocrat or even a dictator. Does he strike you as somebody with whom the EU can build a strategic partnership in the future? And my second question is more focused on Hong Kong. Are you satisfied with the response you got from the Chinese leadership today? And if not, what actions is the EU prepared to take when the national security law is enforced? Thank you.
So we were very clear in our conversations that Beijing's imposition of a national security law on Hong Kong does not conform with the Hong Kong Basic Law, nor with China's international commitments. This was very clear. The national security law risks seriously undermining the one country, two systems principle and Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy we wish to see stay in place. And it is this autonomy that has allowed Hong Kong to flourish and to be so successful. So we also conveyed that China risks very negative consequences if it goes forward with imposing this law. The European Union is in touch with our G7 partners on this topic, and we've made our position very clear to the Chinese leadership today and urged them to reconsider. Of course, they have a different standpoint than us, but this is our very clear standpoint we conveyed to the Chinese leadership.
Mr. President.
It's our intention to continue to monitor the situation. We expressed clearly our opinion on that, and I would like to remember that the day after the announcement by the Chinese authorities of this security law, we reacted as European Union. Immediately we reacted, and we spoke loud and clear today, and we will follow the situation.
Thank you. We'll take a last question by Gavin Lee from the BBC News. Gavin, can you hear us? Please unmute. We can't hear you.
Second. Is that better?
Yeah,
That's better.
Yeah, it works.
3 years ago, President Tusk, predecessor Charles Michel, talked about 4 external threats to the EU and the aggression from Russia, radical Islam, and also China was the core group. 3 years on.
I'm sorry, but could you rephrase your question, because the connection is really bad.
Yes, I'll try and be brief. Can you give me a sense of what your assessment is of China as an external threat to the EU, given your comments by President Tusk 3 years ago, if that makes sense as the first question? And the second issue is on the comments from President von der Leyen. You said a moment ago that on the issue of Chinese disinformation and propaganda, we pointed out clearly, you said, that this cannot be tolerated. Can you explain what the conversation was and what the Chinese president said in reply?
We have a very clear approach. We think that it's essential to have a dialogue because we need a dialogue if we want to promote our values, if we want to defend our interests. It doesn't mean that we agree on everything. It's not the case. We expressed that on different points. We think that we need to work together to improve some concrete cooperation, but at the same time, we disagree on very important and essential topics. And we had the occasion to promote our values, to explain why we consider that it's so important to promote and to support the human rights, to protect the minorities, or to consider, for example, that the status in Hong Kong is very important and that we need to respect this high degree of autonomy in Hong Kong. We had this occasion, and it's our intention at the international level to continue to speak also with countries with which we don't agree about everything.
So, indeed, you mentioned Donald Tusk, and may I quote or cite the description that the Commission has on our EU-China relations. You know that we describe these relations as being that China is for the European Union a negotiating partner, an economic competitor, and a systemic rival. And you have to see all three together. And the negotiating partner, for example, you can see on that we are close to have the agreement now on the geographical indications. This would be a negotiation success in a certain field. The economic competitor, the first question in this press conference related to that too. So the fact that we are working hard on having a fair market access to these economic competitors, so fair conditions, for us is not important to have the market access to have the same outcome. But what we want is the same and fair opportunities. This is for us important to be here clear with our economic competitor. The same goes for the topic of the subsidies we've been discussing. For us it's important that we negotiate rules for subsidies. There are subsidies out there, of course, globally, but that we negotiate modern rules in the WTO framework we can agree on, and everybody's playing by the same rules. So here, economic competitor and systemic rival. That means these are two very different systems, very different views on values. What the European Union is concerned, or China. And in this category, of course, goes the topic of cybersecurity. We know that we've seen attacks on cybersecurity, on the cyber attacks in the past, as I said, on computing systems, on hospitals, and we know the origin of the cyber attacks. The same goes for disinformation. You know that the European Union is very active on dismantling the disinformation. So by doing so, you go to the source and you have an idea where the disinformation comes from. So on our side, we put against them the facts and the figures that are necessary to know. And these three descriptions, negotiation partner, economic competitor and systemic rival, shows the relationship that is not an easy one, but one we're working on.
Thank you, Madam and Mr. President. This concludes our press conference. Please check our joint press release on our both websites. Thank you.